We're tracking some big headlines out of the Middle East and Israel this morning. 3 U.S. allies in Europe have announced that they will recognize a Palestinian state. And that, of course, follows the International Criminal Court, the ICC, saying that Israel's prime minister, in addition to the leaders of Hamas, should be charged with crimes against humanity. So it's a lot to get to. Fortunately, we've got retired Army Lieutenant General and CBS News contributor H.R. McMaster here. He also served as National Security Advisor in the Trump administration. General, thank you very much for being here. I want to start with the ICC prosecutors' request for warrants, because on the one hand, you've got the chair of urban warfare at West Point, John Spencer, saying Israel's done more than any army in history to protect civilians. That's one idea. And then the other idea is crimes against humanity. That's a lot of daylight.
Yeah, well, it is a lot of daylight, and I think it's really important to recognize this is a false kind of moral equivalence here with the ICC between a state that's a democracy, that has a functioning judicial system that can look into the excess deaths associated, civilian deaths, horrible deaths associated with the use of force in Gaza, but also, you have a terrorist organization that conducted the October 7th attacks and deliberately targeted civilians. Mass murder, rape, infanticide, and still the hostages are still in Gaza. So I think it's a travesty, actually, to have these indictments at the same time. And from the perspective of Israel, I mean, this is a great reward for Hamas to suggest that equivalency, especially coming with the recognition that you mentioned of the 3 states that just said they're going to recognize a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
I mean, is October 7th going to be Independence Day?
That is a great fear of people on the Israeli side, for sure. Israel is now moving into Rafah after nearly 1 million civilians have moved out of Rafah. The Biden administration is still hesitant to say we like the plan. They're still on the fence. But does Israel have to go into Gaza or into Rafah? Is this a requirement for victory?
Tony, absolutely, because Hamas is still there. Hamas has the guns, and Hamas will just come back. So if you look really at the inclination to want a Palestinian state, to have a Palestinian state that coexists with Israel, who doesn't want that? We want that, right, for the Palestinian people. But the main obstacle to that is Hamas, an organization that took over and has stayed in power through force since 2005 and doesn't let any kind of opposition emerge. I mean, who's going to be the mayor of Gaza? Nobody, because they're going to get a bullet in the head from Hamas from day one. So it's important to dispute.
Israel's made it clear that Hamas has to be eradicated. But I think at what point do your actions outweigh your goals? So many people are saying all
when
these...
you can consider the collateral damage that has happened.
Yes.
So here's what I think is paradoxical about this. To say that Israel should only have limited raids into Rafah, that's actually more dangerous for the civilian population, especially a civilian population that is being used as human shields for Hamas, who's underground, probably with the hostages, ready to reemerge and try to reassert control over Gaza. So a large-scale operation is actually safer for civilians, because when you're in close combat with the enemy, even in dense urban terrain, you can differentiate between those who are hostile and those who are innocent.
Do we just have to accept more civilians will die? We just have to accept that?
Well, I think in a larger scale operation, fewer civilians are harmed or killed.
Okay.
Because on the ground, if you're in a tank or if you're infantry and you go into a building, you're clearing the building and you're giving the enemy an opportunity to reveal their hostile intent, right? Because you're placing something of value at risk, a value to the enemy at risk, which is their safe haven there. If you just use bombs or even just raids, remember Black Hawk Down, right? That was a raid. That was a precise operation. But when you're in a dense urban area, those operations go wrong. And then typically, there's a much larger number of civilian deaths as a result.
Let's shift gears to another conflict, Ukraine and Russia. And Russian forces have made advances in the north and northeast of Kharkiv. What do you make of what's going on there, given that that is Ukraine's second largest city?
Right. Well, I think what the Russians are trying to do, and this is what many analysts have noted, is trying to divert Ukrainian forces away from the main Russian offensive operations north of Avdiivka. And it's having that effect. The Ukrainians are having to shift some forces. But I think it's very unlikely that the Russians will be able to achieve a breakthrough in either place. Putin is putting more and more pressure on the Ukrainians right now, but at an extremely high cost, like 1,000 casualties a day. So I don't think that's sustainable. The Ukrainians, I believe, will be able to maintain this defense. And Kharkiv will not fall, I believe, because, these cities swallow armies. And you're looking at maybe a 30,000 size force there in the north with maybe 10,000 more forming around north of the border in Russia.
Sounds like a summer of war in both countries.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, it is. And I just would like to say, I think in the Middle East, it's going to get worse.
Worse.
Because you have Hezbollah still in southern Lebanon. And I think Israel's already determined that it has to clear that terrorist infrastructure so they can allow the 80,000 displaced Israelis to return to northern Israel.
You can't help but to think about those civilians. General, thank you.